Sarah Chun pulled herself through the maintenance tunnel with practiced ease, her tool belt clanking softly against the metal. Walls around her, the terminus station, stretched out in all directions, like a massive wheel spinning slowly in the darkness of space. She had worked here for 3 years now, fixing pipes and replacing worn-out circuits while hundreds of alien species went about their lives just beyond these narrow passages. It was a good job, boring, maybe, but it paid well enough to send money back home to her parents in Shanghai. Her radio crackled to life with the station manager's voice asking about the progress on Sector 7. "Almost done," Sarah replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her glove. "Just need to replace one more conduit and I'll be finished." The tunnel opened up into a wider corridor, and Sarah dropped down onto the polished floor of the educational wing. This part of the station always felt different from the industrial sections where she usually worked. Everything here was cleaner and brighter, designed to welcome the young ones from across the galaxy who came to learn about other cultures. Sarah grabbed her equipment bag and started walking toward the faulty power junction when she heard the sound of many small voices chattering in high-pitched tones. She turned the corner and nearly bumped into a group of small aliens being led by a taller member of their species. The children, if that was the right word for them, looked like a cross between frogs and seals, with smooth bluish skin that seemed to shimmer under the lights. Their large eyes blinked at her with curiosity, and several of them pointed at her with their webbed hands. "A human!" One of them squeaked in surprisingly clear standard Galactic. Look, a real human." The teacher, who Sarah assumed was named something she couldn't pronounce, made a soothing gesture with its flippers. "Instructor Kell apologizes for the students' excitement," a translation device on the teacher's chest announced. They have never seen a human in person before. Sarah smiled and gave them a small wave. "No problem," she said. "I don't mind." The children seemed thrilled by this, and several of them waved back enthusiastically. Instructor Kell explained they were Velik's children from the Tamra colony, and today was their first trip to a space station. They were here to see the viewing deck where they could look out at the stars and the massive ships that came and went from Terminus. Sarah wished them a good trip and continued on her way to fix the junction box. These Velik's kids seemed sweet and fragile, nothing like the rough-and-tumble children she remembered from her own school days back on Earth. She wondered what it must be like to grow up on a low-gravity moon where everything was soft and safe. The junction box took longer to repair than she expected because someone had installed the wrong type of connector during the last maintenance cycle. Sarah muttered complaints under her breath as she carefully removed the damaged parts and replaced them with the correct components. Finally, after 40 minutes of careful work, the indicator lights switched from red to green. She packed up her tools and reported the completion to her supervisor. "Good work, Chun," the voice on the radio said. "Head back to the main hub and take your lunch break." Sarah was just sealing her equipment bag when the station's emergency alarm began to wail. The sound was different from the usual drills. This was the real thing. A harsh screaming noise that made her heart jump. Red lights started flashing along the corridor walls, and the calm voice of the station AI began speaking in multiple languages. "Collision event in Outer Ring Sector 9, the AI announced. "All personnel evacuate affected areas immediately. Emergency bulkheads engaging in 60 seconds. Sarah's training kicked in. Instantly, she needed to get to the nearest emergency exit, which should be just 2 corridors away. But then she heard something that made her freeze, the sound of children screaming in terror. The Velik's class. Sarah ran toward the sound instead of away from it, her legs pumping as she rounded the corner into the viewing deck area. What she saw made her stomach drop. The beautiful transparent dome that showed the stars had a massive crack running through it. And air was already whistling out through the growing gap. Instructor Kel lay motionless under a fallen display panel. Clearly unconscious or worse, the 23 Velix children stood in a tight group in the center of the room. Their bodies completely rigid with fear. Sarah had read about this. The Velix had evolved on a world with almost no predators, and their response to sudden danger was to freeze completely. They couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't save themselves. The station AI's voice continued its countdown. Emergency bulkheads engaging in 45 seconds. Sarah knew what that meant. Massive metal doors would slam shut to contain the breach and protect the rest of the station. Anyone still in this section would be trapped with rapidly depleting air until rescue teams could cut through, but rescue would take hours and these kids would be dead in minutes. Once the dome gave way completely, the emergency exit was right there. Just 20 meters behind her. She could make it easily if she ran now. Standard protocol was clear. Save yourself first. Let the emergency teams handle casualties. Sarah looked at the frozen children and then at the exeter. Mind calculated the odds and told her this was impossible. She couldn't carry 23 children to safety in 45 seconds, but her body was already moving, already running toward the kids instead of away from them. 30 seconds to bulkhead closure. The AI announced. Sarah reached the first group of children and scooped up 2 of them, one under each arm. They were surprisingly light, maybe 15 or 20 pounds each. Their bodies still frozen in fear. She ran toward the maintenance corridor she had used earlier. It had an emergency airlock that could be manually sealed. Her lungs already burned from the thinning air, but she pushed harder. She dumped the first 2 children through the airlock door and ran back 20 seconds. 3 more children this time. Her arms straining but holding. The cold was intense now as the atmosphere escaped into space. Back again. 4 children grabbed and carried. Her hands were going numb. 10 seconds. The dome cracked wider with a dome's sound like thunder, and the wind became a hurricane trying to pull everything out into the void. Sarah grabbed 2 more children and fought against the suction. She could see ice forming on the walls around her. 5 more trips, she calculated desperately. But there was no time. 5 seconds. She reached the last group of 4 children. Just as the emergency bulkhead began its descent with a grinding roar, Sarah threw herself forward, sliding across the floor with all 4 small bodies clutched against her chest. The metal door slammed down behind her heels with a boom that shook the entire corridor. But she wasn't safe yet. She was on the wrong side of the airlock door with the last 4 children. Maintenance corridor still had its own breach. Somewhere in the air was almost gone. Sarah's vision started to narrow into a dark tunnel, but she forced herself to move. She dragged the children through the inner airlock door and hit the emergency seal button. The door hissed shut, and new air flooded in. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, her whole body shaking. All 23 children lay around her, starting to move again as their fear freeze wore off. They were alive. Every single one of them was alive. Sarah tried to take a breath, but her chest wouldn't work properly. She saw boots running toward her and heard voices shouting, but they sounded very far away. Then everything went dark. Pain was the first thing Sarah felt when consciousness returned her. Chest burned with each breath, as if someone had filled her lungs with broken glass. The medical bay lights were too bright even through her closed eyelids, and she could hear the steady beeping of monitoring equipment somewhere nearby. A voice spoke in soft tones. Not human, she realized, but using standard galactic through a translator. Her vitals are stabilizing, the voice said. The lung damage was severe, but the regeneration treatments are working. Sarah tried to open her eyes, but they felt glued shut. Her whole body ached in ways she had never experienced before. How long? Another voice asked. This one definitely human. She has been unconscious for 3 days. The alien voice replied. We nearly lost her twice during the first night. 3 days? Sarah forced her eyes open, despite the pain, and saw 2 figures standing beside her bed. One was Dr. Harrison, the human physician assigned to Terminus Station. The other was a tall crystalline being she recognized as one of the Qual medical specialists, Sarah. Dr. Harrison moved closer, his face showing relief. Thank God. We weren't sure you would wake up. Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The Qual doctor moved away and returned with a cup of water, helping her take small sips. The children. Sarah finally managed to croak out. Are they all alive? Dr. Harrison interrupted with a smile. Every single one of them survived without a scratch. Thanks to you. Relief flooded through Sarah, and she let her head fall back against the pillow. That was all that mattered. What you did was incredibly dangerous, Dr. Harrison continued, his tone becoming more serious. You suffered severe decompression injuries, hypothermia, and radiation exposure from the damaged hull plating. The Qual doctor made a sound like chimes ringing. Dangerous is insufficient description, it said. What this human did should have been fatal. Multiple times over. Sarah didn't understand what they meant. She had just done what needed to be done. Anyone would have made the same choice. How bad is the station damage? She asked. Trying to change the subject, Dr. Harrison and the Qual doctor exchanged glances. The station will be fine, Harrison said slowly. Sarah, you need to understand what's been happening while you were unconscious. He pulled up a holographic display that showed news feeds from across the sector. Sarah saw her own face on dozens of different channels. Security footage of her running through the collapsing viewing deck with children in her arms. The whole galaxy has been watching the footage, Harrison explained. You're famous. Sarah stared at the screens in confusion. Headlines were in multiple languages, but her translator converted them automatically. Human performs impossible rescue. Engineer defies death to save 23. What else are humans capable of? I don't understand, Sarah said weakly. Why is this such a big deal? The Qual doctor leaned forward, and its crystalline body reflected the light in rainbow patterns. Because what you did is beyond the capabilities of most species in the galaxy, it explained gently. The conditions you survived in that corridor would have killed any Velix in seconds. Any Qual in perhaps 30 seconds. Dr. Harrison nodded and pulled up more data. You operated in near-vacuum conditions for almost 3 minutes, he said. The average human might survive 90 seconds, but you were also fighting hurricane-force decompression, carrying weight, and making complex decisions under extreme stress. Sarah shook her head slightly. I'm not special, she protested. I'm just a maintenance engineer. Any human could have. That's exactly what's shocking them. Harrison interrupted. You're not a trained soldier or emergency responder. You're an ordinary human who just happened to be there. And you still pulled off what most of the galaxy considers physically impossible. Over the next few hours, Sarah learned just how much her life had changed. The Velix government had declared a sector-wide day of celebration in honor of her actions. The families of the 23 children were waiting outside the medical bay, hoping to thank her personally. News organizations from hundreds of worlds wanted interview scientists were requesting permission to study the rescue footage to better understand human capabilities. There's also this, Dr. Harrison said quietly. Pulling up one more document was an official communication from the Velix Council, written in flowing script that her translator rendered into English. The letter explained that according to Velix tradition, anyone who saved a child's life became Korma, a concept that translated roughly as life-giver or second mother. Sarah had not saved one child, but 23, making her Korma to all of them. The families considered her part of their extended kinship groups now, bound by ties that Velik's culture held as sacred as blood relations. "I just wanted to help," Sarah whispered, feeling overwhelmed at the reality of what had happened was starting to sink, and she had nearly died. Those children would have died if she hadn't acted. Thought made her feel sick. "You did more than help," the Qual Doctor said. "You showed the galaxy something they had forgotten, that individuals can choose to act beyond their apparent limitations." Dr. Harrison squeezed her hand gently. "You need to rest now," he said. "But when you're ready, there are a lot of people who want to meet you." Sarah closed her eyes. Suddenly exhausted again, she didn't want to be famous or celebrated. She just wanted to go back to her quiet life, fixing pipes and sending money home. But somehow she knew that life was gone forever. Door to the medical bay opened, and Sarah heard small voices speaking in rapid, high-pitched Velix opened her eyes to see several of the children she had saved peeking around the doorway. Their large eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Dr. Harrison started to shoo them away, but Sarah raised her hand. "Let them in," she said softly. The children approached slowly. Almost shyly, the smallest one, who couldn't have been more than 5 in human years, carried something in its webbed hands, a drawing made with colorful markers. The child held it up for Sarah to see. It showed a crude but recognizable figure of a human surrounded by smaller figures that must have been Velik's children. Above the drawing, written in careful letters, were words in both Velik's and Standard Galactic. "Thank you, Korma." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Before she could stop them, the children gathered around her bed, and one of the older ones reached out carefully to touch her hand. "You saved us," the child said in Standard Galactic. "We were so scared and couldn't move, but you came back. You didn't leave us." Sarah tried to smile through her tears. "I couldn't leave you," she said simply. The children stayed for a few more minutes before Dr. Harrison gently ushered them out to let Sarah rest as she drifted back towards sleep. Sarah thought about the choice she had made in those critical seconds. She could have run to safety. No one would have blamed her, but she would have had to live with the knowledge that she could have tried and didn't. That would have been worse than any physical injury. As consciousness faded, she realized that maybe she did understand why people were making such a big deal about what happened, not because she had done something impossible, but because she had chosen to try even when success seemed impossible. That choice, apparently, was what made her story worth telling. 6 months had passed since the accident, and Sarah still wasn't used to being recognized. Everywhere she went, she walked through the main concourse of Terminus Station with her head down, hoping to avoid attention, but it never worked for long. "That's her," someone would whisper, and then heads would turn and beings from a dozen different species would stare, some wanted autographs or photos. Others just wanted to touch her, as if she were some kind of good luck charm. Sarah had learned to smile politely and keep moving. The worst part was that she couldn't go back to her maintenance job. Station management had promoted her to safety consultant, which sounded impressive, but mostly meant attending endless meetings where administrators asked her opinion on protocols. She didn't fully understand. They seemed to think that because she had survived the impossible once, she must be an expert on all things related to emergency response. She wasn't, was just an engineer who had gotten lucky. The messages never stopped either. Her personal terminal received thousands of communications daily from across the sector, some thanking her, some asking for help with their own problems, some proposing marriage from species she couldn't even pronounce. Sarah had stopped reading them weeks ago and let an AI filter handle the responses. Her quarters on the station had become a shrine of sorts, filled with gifts from grateful Velik's families, woven tapestries, carved sculptures, jars of preserved foods, traditional clothing all piled up because she didn't have the heart to refuse them or give them away. The only gifts she truly treasured were the drawings. From the children themselves, each one showed her in different ways, sometimes as a giant protector, sometimes with wings like an angel from human mythology, sometimes just as a simple stick figure holding their hands. These she kept displayed on her walls and looked at whenever the weight of everything else became too much. Today was particularly difficult because she had been summoned to appear before the Galactic Council, not for anything she had done wrong, but because they wanted her to testify about human capabilities and whether humans should be assigned to more dangerous roles across the galaxy. Sarah sat in the waiting area outside the council chambers, a dress uniform, feeling stiff and uncomfortable. She had never been good at public speaking, and the thought of addressing representatives from hundreds of worlds made her want to throw up. "Sarah-chun?" A voice called. She looked up to see an insectoid being with multiple compound eyes and chitinous armor covering its body. The creature held a recording device in one of its many limbs. "I am Kratal," the being said through its translator. "I am a journalist from the Sector News Network. May I ask you a few questions before your testimony?" Sarah almost said no. She was tired of journalists, but something about Kratal's demeanor made her pause, and like most reporters, who practically vibrated with excitement when they saw her, Kratal seemed calm and genuinely curious. "I suppose," Sarah said reluctantly. "But I don't have much time." Kratal's mandibles clicked in what might have been a smile. "I will be brief," it said. "Tell me, do you consider yourself a hero?" Sarah had been asked this question 100 times and usually gave some diplomatic answer, but today she was too tired for diplomacy. "No," she said bluntly. "I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done." Kratal's antennae twitched. "But you risked your life for children who were not of your species," it pressed. "Most beings cannot even comprehend such a choice." Sarah frowned. "Why is that so hard to understand?" she asked. "They were kids in danger. Someone had to help them, because most species prioritize survival of self, then family, then tribe," Kratal explained. "The idea of risking certain death for strangers, especially strangers from another species, goes against billions of years of evolutionary programming." Sarah hadn't thought about it that way, but humans do it all the time, she protested. Firefighters run into burning buildings. Lifeguards dive into dangerous water. Soldiers throw themselves on grenades to save their comrades. Kratal made a sound like grinding gears. "Exactly," it said. "This is what fascinates and frightens the galaxy about your species. You have this capacity for self-sacrifice that seems to override your survival instinct." The journalist leaned closer. "Tell me honestly, in that moment when you chose to go back for the children, did you think you would survive?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, remembering that split second when she had made her choice. "No," she finally admitted. "I thought I was probably going to die, but I knew I had to try anyway, because the alternative, living with the knowledge that I could have helped and didn't, that would have been worse than dying." Kratal's translator was silent for several seconds, as if the AI was struggling to process her words. "This concept," the journalist said slowly, "that some fates are worse than death. This is very human?" "I guess so," Sarah said with a shrug. "I never really thought about it before." The doors to the council chambers opened, and an attendant called her name. Sarah stood up, and Kratal stepped back. "Thank you for your honesty," the journalist said. "I think I understand better now." Sarah walked into the massive chamber where hundreds of beings from countless worlds waited to hear her speak. The room was designed to accommodate different atmosphere requirements. With sections separated by transparent force fields, Sarah stood at a central podium where her words would be translated simultaneously into every language. Represented the questions came one after another. Could humans survive in other extreme environments? Should humans be trained for dangerous rescue operations? Were all humans capable of what she had done? Or was she exceptional, even among her own kind? Sarah answered as honestly as she could. She explained that she was not special by human standards, just ordinarily fit and trained in basic emergency procedures. She described human physiology and how evolution on Earth's higher gravity with abundant predators had shaped them into resilient generalists. She talked about human culture and how many societies taught the value of helping others, even at personal cost. But when a representative from the Korth Federation asked whether humans could be trusted with greater responsibility in dangerous situations, Sarah hesitated. "I can only speak for myself," she said carefully. "I'm not a soldier or a professional rescuer. I'm an engineer who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place." A Velix council member interjected gently. Depending on perspective, murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. "The question we face?" the council speaker said, projecting its voice to fill the space, "is whether humanity represents a new resource for the galaxy's most dangerous challenges, or whether your capabilities make you too valuable to risk." Sarah felt a flash of anger at being discussed like a tool or commodity. "We're not a resource," she said more sharply than she intended. "We're people. Individual people who make our own choices about what risks we want to take." The chamber fell silent. "I didn't save those children because I'm human," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "I saved them because in that moment I chose to. Any one of you could make the same choice, regardless of your species, if you decided their lives mattered more than your fear." She paused and looked around at the hundreds of alien faces watching her. "The real question isn't what humans are capable of," she said. "It's what any of us are capable of when we choose to act despite our limitations." The testimony continued for another hour, but Sarah barely remembered the rest of it. She answered questions mechanically while her mind turned over what she had said. Had she really believed those words, or was she just saying what she thought they wanted to hear? When she was finally dismissed, Sarah returned to her quarters exhausted. She found a message waiting from K-Trolls. Journalist had sent her the article that will be published tomorrow, asking if she wanted to review it for accuracy. Sarah read through it and was surprised to find that Krital had focused less on the physical details of her rescue and more on the philosophical implications. The article asked what it meant that an ordinary member of a young species had demonstrated a capacity for self-sacrifice that challenged the galaxy's understanding of rational behavior. It suggested that perhaps the galaxy had become too safe, too comfortable, and had forgotten that progress sometimes required individuals to risk everything. Sarah sent back her approval of the article and added a personal note. "Thank you for trying to understand instead of just being amazed." Krital replied almost immediately. "Understanding is more useful than amazement. Amazement fades, but understanding changes how we think." Sarah smiled at that. Maybe this whole experience wasn't entirely terrible if her story could make people think differently about what was possible. Then perhaps all the attention and disruption had been worth it. She looked at the drawings from the children on her wall and felt the familiar mixture of pride and discomfort. She would never see herself as a hero. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the real value in what had happened was showing everyone, human and alien alike, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose to act. The nightmares started 3 months after the council testimony. Sarah would wake up gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat. The memory of whistling air and frozen metal still vivid in her mind. Sometimes in her dreams she was too slow and watched the children get pulled out into space. Other times she made it to safety, but heard their screams echoing forever in the darkness. Dr. Harrison referred her to a qual therapist who specialized in trauma. But talking about it only seemed to make the dreams worse. Sarah learned to live with them instead, drinking strong coffee to stay alert during the day and accepting exhaustion as her new normal state. Work became her escape, even though her new position frustrated her. She threw herself into reviewing safety protocols and designing better emergency systems. Anything to keep her mind occupied and useful. The attention from the public had shifted from celebration to something more complicated. Some species now looked at humans with open fear, whispering when Sarah walked past about how dangerous her kind must be. Others treated her with an almost religious reverence that made her deeply uncomfortable. She received death threats from extremist groups who believed humans were a threat to galactic peace. She also received marriage proposals from admirers who seemed to think she was some kind of superhuman warrior goddess. Neither group understood that she was just Sarah Chun from Shanghai who used to fix pipes for a living. The only beings who treated her normally were the Velix families. They invited her to celebrations and holidays, sent her pictures of the children growing up, and always made sure she knew she was welcome in their homes. One of the children she had saved had become especially attached to her. The young Velix was now 9 years old and sent Sarah messages almost every day, sometimes asking questions about humans, sometimes just sharing stories about school. Sarah treasured these communications because they reminded her why she had made her choice that day. One afternoon, Sarah received an urgent message from the Velix government. She opened it expecting another formal thank you or invitation to some ceremony. But what she read made her blood run cold. The Tamar colony, the home world of the children she had saved, was in danger. A massive solar storm was approaching that would overwhelm their planetary shields and irradiate the surface. The colony needed to be evacuated within 2 weeks or thousands of Velix would die. The message specifically requested that Sarah Chun come to help coordinate the evacuation. The Velix people trusted her with their lives, particularly their children, and wanted her expertise in emergency situations. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. She wasn't an evacuation expert. She had no training in large-scale disaster response. She had saved 23 children through sheer desperation and luck, not skill. But when she looked at the attached files showing the bloody-eyed faces of thousands of Velix who needed help, including many of the families who had welcomed her so warmly, she knew she couldn't refuse. Sarah accepted the assignment. Despite her doubts, 2 days later, she boarded a transport ship heading for the Tamar colony along with a mixed team of emergency response specialists from various species. The team leader was a Korth named Vex, who had clearly read about Sarah's rescue and expected her to be some kind of miracle worker. "We are honored to have you with us," Vex said when they met, its translated voice somehow managing to sound both respectful and skeptical. "Your reputation precedes you." Sarah sighed internally. "I'm just here to help however I can," she said, trying to downplay expectations. "I'm not an expert in evacuations." "Perhaps not," Vex replied, "but you have proven you can function under conditions that would incapacitate most of us. That may prove valuable." The journey to Tamar took 3 days. Sarah spent most of that time reviewing evacuation plans and trying to learn everything she could about the colony's layout and population distribution. The more she studied, the more overwhelming the task seemed. They needed to move 40,000 Velix to orbital transports before the solar storm hit. Many of the evacuees were elderly or very young and would need special assistance. The colony's transportation infrastructure was designed for normal operations, not mass exodus at night. Sarah lay in her bunk on the transport ship and felt the familiar anxiety building in her chest. What if she failed? What if people died because she wasn't good enough? Kratal, the journalist who had interviewed her before the council testimony, had somehow gotten assigned to cover the evacuation. The insectoid being found Sarah in the ship's common area one evening, staring at evacuation charts without really seeing them. "You are worried," Kratal observed, settling into a seat designed for its body type. "Of course I'm worried," Sarah said. "Thousands of lives depend on us getting this right. Yet you chose to come anyway," Kratal pointed out. "Even though you could have refused," Sarah shrugged. "They asked for my help. How could I say no?" "Most beings would find a way," the journalist said. "They would cite lack of expertise, prior commitments, or simply fear of failure." "Maybe I'm an idiot then," Sarah muttered as mandibles clicked in amusement. "Or perhaps you understand something that others have forgotten, that we grow by accepting challenges that frighten us." Sarah looked at the journalist curiously. "When did you become a philosopher?" "When I started trying to understand humans," Kratal replied. "Your species forces one to think differently about motivation and purpose." They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Kratal spoke again. "May I ask you something personal?" Sarah nodded. "Do you ever regret your choice?" The journalist asked. "Do you wish you had run to safety and let someone else save those children?" Sarah thought about the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When the nightmares are bad, or when people expect me to be something I'm not. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if I had just followed protocol and saved myself. But," Kratal prompted, "but then I think about Prill and the others." Sarah continued. "I think about getting to know them as they grow up, being part of their lives. If I had let them die, I would have lost that. And I would have lost a piece of myself too. The piece that believes doing the right thing matters even when it's hard. This is what I find most interesting about humans." Kratal mused. "You seem to value your idea of yourselves more than your own safety. Is that weird?" Sarah asked. "Very," Kratal confirmed. "But perhaps it is also why you accomplish things others consider impossible." When they arrived at Tamar Colony, Sarah was immediately struck by how beautiful it was. The moon orbited a gas giant, and its surface was covered in shallow seas and floating cities connected by delicate bridges. The Veliks had built their civilization in harmony with the water, creating structures that looked more like living coral reefs than traditional buildings. But hanging over this beauty was the threat of the approaching solar storm. Sarah could see the fear in the eyes of every Veliks she met. They were a peaceful people who had never faced a crisis of this magnitude. The evacuation began immediately. Sarah worked with Vex and the other specialists to coordinate transport schedules and organize the population into manageable groups. Her role was supposed to be advisory, but she quickly found herself making decisions and solving problems as they arose. 3 days into the evacuation, disaster struck one of the main transport hubs. Suffered a power failure that stranded thousands of evacuees with no way to reach the orbital shuttles. The backup systems refused to engage, and time was running out. Sarah found herself crawling through access tunnels again, this time with a Velik's engineer named Theme, who's one of the children she had. Savid Theme was 15 now and had chosen to study engineering. Because of Sarah's influence together, they worked to reroute power while the solar storm grew closer with every passing hour. "Are you scared?" Theme asked as they struggled with corroded connectors. Sarah paused and considered lying to protect the young Veliks, but decided honesty was more respectful. "Yes," she admitted. "I'm terrified we won't finish in time." "But you're still here," Theme observed. "Still working. Being scared doesn't mean you stop," Sarah said. "It just means you have to work a little harder to keep going." Theme's large eyes blinked thoughtfully. "That's What Korma would say, the young Velix murmured. They got the power flowing again, just in time. The evacuation continued, and Sarah worked alongside beings from a dozen different species, each contributing their unique strengths to the effort. She began to realize that her real value wasn't superhuman endurance or impossible feats. It was simply her willingness to try when things seemed hopeless, and her ability to inspire others to do the same. The last transport lifted off from Tamra Colony with just hours to spare before the solar storm hit. Sarah stood in the orbital station with Vex and the rest of the evacuation team, watching through the windows as the moon's surface was battered by radiation. Every single Velix had been saved. 40,000 people were safe because a diverse group of specialists had worked together despite their differences. You were right, Vex said quietly. You are not special. Sarah laughed at the backhanded compliment. Thanks, I think. I mean that what makes you effective is not superhuman capability, Vex clarified. It is your refusal to accept that difficulty justifies inaction. This is a quality any being could cultivate if they chose to. Sarah thought about that. Maybe Vex was right. Maybe the real lesson of her story wasn't about what humans could do, but about what anyone could do if they stopped letting. 2 years after the Tamra Colony evacuation, Sarah Chun stood in front of a classroom filled with students from 12 different species and wondered how her life had gotten so strange. She had never planned to become a teacher yet. Here she was, running what had started as a small training program and had grown into something the galaxy now called Emergency Response Without Borders. The program taught mixed species teams how to work together during crises, combining the unique strengths of different physiologies and cultures to save lives. Sarah paced in front of the holographic display, showing her class a simulation of a station breach similar to the one that had made her famous. The core team members will notice the pressure drop first because of their sensitive antennae, she explained, pointing to the insectoid students in the front row. They need to immediately alert the Velix team members who might freeze from fear. A young Velix student raised a webbed hand. But what if we can't move? The student asked nervously. Our fear freeze is involuntary, which is why the human and Thrall team members will be trained to physically move you to safety if necessary, Sarah replied, gesturing to the larger students in the back. Every species has limitations. The key is learning to compensate for each other's weaknesses. This was the core philosophy Sarah had developed over 2 years of teaching. Stop treating different capabilities as hierarchies and start treating them as pieces of a puzzle that needed to fit together. Her assistant instructor, Prill, moved forward to help demonstrate the next exercise. The young Velix was 17 now and studying to be an emergency response specialist. Prill had become Sarah's right hand in running the program, translating human concepts into ways that other species could understand. Remember, Prill said to the class, Korma Sarah did not save us because she was physically superior. She saved us because she chose to act when she could have chosen safety. Sarah smiled at how naturally Prill had adopted her teaching methods. The young Velix understood that the real lesson wasn't about human endurance, but about the power of individual choice. After class, Sarah met with Kratal in her small office. The journalist had become something of a friend over the years, documenting the growth of Sarah's program and how it was changing emergency response across the sector. Your latest class has very high marks, Kate Rital observed, reviewing the training scores on its datapad. Even the Thrall students who initially refused to work with Velix partners are now performing well as teams. It just takes time, Sarah said, pouring herself coffee. Most species have been isolated for so long that they forgot how to see value in differences. Kurtal's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. You have changed. You know, the journalist said. How so? Sarah asked. "When we first met, you were uncomfortable with attention and desperately wanted to return to anonymity," Kurtal explained. "Now you seek attention for your program and speak publicly without hesitation." Sarah considered this. "I guess I realized that my discomfort doesn't matter as much as the work," she said. "If being famous helps me teach more people and save more lives, then I can deal with being uncomfortable." "This is wisdom," Kurtal observed. "You have learned to use your legend instead of being burdened by it." A message alert chimed on Sarah's terminal. She opened it to find an urgent communication from Terminus Station, the place where everything had started. There was another emergency. A research vessel carrying a mixed crew had suffered catastrophic engine failure near a black hole's event horizon. The gravitational forces were tearing the ship apart, and rescue would require someone to board the vessel and manually override the failing systems while under extreme G-force. Multiple rescue teams had tried and failed. The conditions were simply too harsh for most species to function. Station Command was asking if Sarah would attempt the rescue. She read through the technical specifications and felt her stomach tighten. This was even more dangerous than her first rescue. The chances of survival were minimal. "You don't have to do this," Kurtal said quietly, having read the message over her shoulder. "You have already done enough. No one would blame you for refusing." Sarah thought about the crew trapped on that ship, knowing they would die slowly as the gravity crushed them. She thought about the families who would lose loved ones. She thought about the students she had trained who would hear about her refusal and wonder what it meant. "If I don't go," Sarah said slowly, "then I'm saying that some lives aren't worth the risk. I'm saying that there's a line where trying stops being worthwhile." "That is logical," Kurtal pointed out. "There are always lines. Even you cannot save everyone." "Maybe," Sarah admitted, "but I haven't found my line yet." She accepted the mission 6 hours later. Sarah was on a specialized rescue shuttle with a team that included Prill, Vex from the Tamar evacuation, and 3 of her best students from different species. "You trained us for this," Prill said as they approached the dying ship. "Let us prove we learned." Sarah had planned to go in alone, but looking at her team, she realized it would miss the entire point of what she had been teaching. This wasn't about one person being extraordinary. It was about a group working together to accomplish what none of them could do individually. "Okay," Sarah said. "Here's how we're gonna do this." She outlined a plan that used each team member's strengths. The core student would navigate through the damaged corridors, using its multiple sensory organs to detect weak points. Prill and another Velix would access the ship's computer systems with their delicate manipulators. The Thrall student would carry the heavy equipment through the intense gravity, and Sarah would override the engine controls, which required fine motor control under crushing G-forces that only her species seemed able to maintain. It was risky and complicated, but it might actually work. The rescue was one of the hardest things Sarah had ever done. Gravity inside the damaged ship made every movement feel like pushing through concrete. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, and blood vessels burst in her eyes from the pressure, but her team compensated for her weaknesses when she couldn't communicate clearly through her crushed throat. The course student interpreted her hand signals when she couldn't reach a critical panel. The Thrall student lifted her up despite the extreme weight when she nearly passed out. Prill revived her with stimulants calculated for human physiology. Together, fighting for every centimeter of progress, they reached the engine room and managed to shut down the failing systems. The ship stabilized just enough for the main rescue vessels to attach and pull it away from the black holes. Influence all 17 crew members. Survive. Sarah spent 2 days in medical again. This time, with burst blood vessels throughout her body and several cracked ribs from the pressure. But when she woke up, her team was there waiting. "We did it," Prill said with obvious pride. "Not just you, we did it." Sarah smiled despite the pain. "Yes," she agreed. "We did." The rescue made headlines across the sector. But this time, the story was different. The media focused not just on human capability, but on the mixed species team that had worked together to achieve the impossible. Sarah's students became celebrities themselves. Proof that her training program actually worked over the following months. Requests for the program expanded dramatically. Stations and colonies across the galaxy wanted to establish their own emergency response without borders chapters. Sarah found herself traveling constantly, training new instructors and helping establish programs on dozens of worlds. 2 years to the day after the latest rescue, Sarah was invited to speak at the Galactic Council again. This time, she wasn't nervous. She had something important to say, and she knew exactly how to say it. The chamber was as imposing as she remembered, but Sarah no longer felt small standing at the central podium 4 years ago. "I made a choice that changed my life," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I chose to try to save lives, even though success seemed impossible. Many of you have called me a hero or said that humans are special because of what we can endure," she continued. "But I'm here today to tell you that you've been focusing on the wrong lesson." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. "What I did was not about human superiority," Sarah explained. "It was about individual choice. In that moment, I could have chosen safety, and no one would have blamed me. But I chose to try instead." She pulled up holographic images of her students. These beings, Velix, Korth, Threll, Qual, and dozens of other species, have learned to make the same choice. They've learned to act despite fear, to work together despite differences, to try even when success seems unlikely. The Tamar colony evacuation succeeded because a mixed team chose to work together, Sarah said. The recent ship rescue succeeded for the same reason. This isn't about what humans can do, it's about what any of us can do when we choose to act. She paused and looked around at the hundreds of representatives. Every species in this chamber has unique strengths and limitations. Sarah concluded, humans can endure harsh conditions, but we're terrible at sensing environmental changes. Korth have incredible sensory perception, but fragile bodies. Velix have brilliant minds, but fear responses that can paralyze them. None of these traits make any species better or worse. She continued, they just make us different, and those differences become strengths when we learn to work together instead of competing.